until you have that, you really don't have the two hands clapping. But to answer your question, when I started as an entrepreneur, the common wisdom at the time, and still is in some quarters, is that startups are nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. Large companies write business plans. We were told startups write business plans. Large companies execute per the plan. Here's the schedule, here's the date, here's deliverables, etc. Startups needed to do that. Large companies on day one, had sales, marketing, biz dev. Startups needed to do that. And we did that for 30 or 40 years until we finally understood the big idea, which seems intuitively obvious in hindsight, is startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Large companies, at their core, execute known business models, at their core. And in fact, they grow by doing something repeatable and scalable. But startups are actually searching for a business model. While you believe what you wrote in your plan is given from God, what we now know is no business plan survives first contact with customers. It's a big idea. You could write all you want. In fact, the smarter you are, probably the more likely that document is completely irrelevant the day you actually try to take it outside and meet customers. And by the way, this is not a pitch that says a business plan is not necessary. Of course, every company needs an operating plan. But what we now realize is before we spend our time writing the plan, perhaps we ought to insert some facts rather than some hypotheses into the plan. And that was how things were different.
Which takes us directly to the lean startup. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So I did 8 startups in 21 years, and so I had some experience with entrepreneurship, good, bad, and ugly, and a variety of roles. And unlike my very smart students who now think they're CEOs when they graduate, I kind of had an apprenticeship program where I had various roles of increasing responsibility until I was personally responsible for screwing a couple up. But after 21 years, I had 4 IPOs and 2 okay outcomes, and 2 craters so deep they left their own iridium layer. In fact, in one of them, I had just been on the cover of an internet magazine called Wired. I don't know if anybody's seen Wired magazine. And 90 days later, I realized the company was going out of business, but I was still getting reprints of the article. And then when I created the company, and back then this was a lot of money, I lost $35 million. And I called my mother, who at the time was still alive, living in Queens, who was a Russian immigrant, and said, "Mom, I lost $35 million. And because English wasn't her first language, I always knew I had a pause for simultaneous translation, and pause, and then she said, "Oh, where'd you put it?" I said, no, Mom, I spent it, it's all gone. Long pause, translation process, and then she went, "Oh, the country we came from is gone. There's nowhere else for us to go." I said, no. And then she said, "And our name's already blank. We can't even change it." And I said, no. The reason I'm calling you now is the people who lost the $35 million gave me another $12 million to do my next company. There were languages I didn't even understand. It's like, in fact, she defaulted to English, which was the first time I heard that. And then she said, "They told us the streets were paved with gold in America. I never believed it till now." And, in fact, my mom never believed I had an honest job till I retired and started teaching at Stanford and UCSF. And then she said, "Oh, you now have a job." And I said, "What do you think I did for the last 21 years?" But to answer your question, my career was executing startups the old way. That is, write the plan, execute the plan, succeed or fail after you ship. Only learn that you did things wrong way after you've burned a lot of cash. What I did when I retired was actually, for the first time in my career, I actually had some time to be thoughtful. And the thoughtful part was thinking through of how did we do things versus what succeeded and failed and why. And what I realized was perhaps the way we were telling entrepreneurs to build startups was simply wrong. And wrong not like bad, it's not like no company ever went public or succeeded, but bad in terms of incredibly inefficient. Because no one had ever articulated that there was a distinction between execution, which is what existing companies focus on, and search for what startups do. That wasn't even a language to describe this. And so I started thinking about what the key ideas were and what was missing. And so I wrote a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany, which essentially kicked off what's now called the Lean Startup Movement. And the Lean Startup Movement says, look, one of the mistakes we were making in entrepreneurship was assuming that because you are a passionate founder and believe implicitly you understand a problem and want to build the solution on day one. Our mistake was simply giving you money to execute like you're right. Instead of saying all you have is a series of untested hypotheses. It's a big idea. On day one, perhaps your science is correct, but the other 90% of what it takes to build a company, who the customer segments, what's the channel, how are you going to be reimbursed, what are the regulatory issues, how do you do clinical trials, and all the other things are just a series of untested hypotheses, unless you're a domain expert in every one of them, the science and the commercial side, and that Venn diagram is pretty small, it's probably 0. And so the question was, can we build a process to rapidly test hypotheses? And by the way, outside of, when I teach at Stanford, I remind my students we use the word hypotheses there because their parents are paying $50,000 a year. But outside of an academic institution, the word hypotheses are, guess. And so if you really think about a startup, it's maybe some of your insight about science wrapped around a series of untested guesses about the commercialization component. And so what we now do is we've put together a series of components that allow us to rapidly test hypotheses. We call that the Lean Startup, and it has 3 components. One is we use something called the business model diagram, invented by someone named Alexander Osterwalder, to kind of frame the hypotheses. And it literally is a diagram, a single page, which lists the 9 components you need to worry about in a business. What are you building? We call value proposition. Who are the customers? What's the channel? How are you going to create demand? How are you going to make revenue? What activities, resources, and partners do you need? And what are the costs? Every company, whether it's a large company or new venture, needs to understand all these 3 things. And this is really interesting for scientists and academics who think, oh, a company, it's just nothing more than all my science, and I just need to write it up, and people will stand outside my lab door and put bags of money there. And in fact, I ought to be sure that the space I rent is big enough to hold all the money. It doesn't work that way. All the other components that surround the science is what makes the difference between an idea and a company. But step 1 is just simply articulating these hypotheses. Who do I think the customers are? And by the way, these models, these are called business models, differ dramatically between therapeutics and diagnostics and devices and digital health. Even though we kind of say life sciences, they're completely different about each one of these components. The second part is we then get outside the lab or building with a process called customer development, and we rapidly test these hypotheses. Now, for a scientist or an academic, what do you mean get out of the building? That's why I have grad students. Or better, that's why I hire some consultants. Are you telling me I'm a principal investigator, for God's sake? I haven't been outside the building. I don't even know what year it is. And by the way, we do this with the NSF and now NIH. The PIs get out, or they're not in the program, meaning they get outside the building as part of this process. In fact, we'll talk about this program we teach. They speak to over 100 customers and partners within 10 weeks. And I don't mean like phone calls. I mean eyeball to eyeball. The definition is if you haven't seen their pupils dilate, you haven't done a customer visit. The third component, besides getting out, is creating something called the minimum viable product, which is we use an agile engineering methodology to kind of construct prototypes that change over time and get more sophisticated depending on customer feedback. And believe it or not, you could do that for therapeutics with mocking up what some of the high quality data might look like, to devices where you can mock up key components of the device, to digital health where it's incredibly easy, etc. And so those 3 components, business model canvas, customer development, and agile engineering, make up what we call the Lean Startup.
And you hit on something that is entombed in your books and very, very important, and for that matter, encoded only by you. although people had, as you've indicated, discovered it on their own. Customer development. Tell us about customer development, and maybe give us an example of something that's not in the life science field and something that maybe would work with the customer development in the life science field.
So, customer development simply has two really interesting tenets. It says, and I remind my principal investigators when we teach scientists, let's agree, just as a starter, that you are the smartest person in your building. Maybe in your entire university. That's a given. And some of you are nodding, saying, well, yes, I am. But let's also agree that it's probably theoretically impossible for you to be smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers. That's a big idea. Right? Let's give it, I'm not going to question your science, but I am going to question that you might not know exactly what's in the pipeline of Pfizer or Merck or anybody else, or J&J or Medtronic, depending on your segment. And therefore, we could conclude there are no facts about most of the commercialization things you need to know inside your building. So get the heck outside. And the customer development process is built around those two key ideas. Is there's more stuff we need to know. And in fact, it gets us into and then I'll answer your question about examples. This kind of worked for NSF, but when I started working with NIH, I realized that the word commercialization kind of means translational medicine for life sciences. And for those of you involved with NIH, you may know they spent $757 million last year on not only NCATs, but all the SBIR stuff and the rest inside of NIH. And we've gotten smarter over what translational medicine has meant in the last, 10, 20, 30 years, with the idea of what we're trying to do is bring stuff from the lab bench to the bedside as quickly as possible. And first it used to mean let's give scientists dedicated space for commercialization, and then maybe let's give them some additional funds, the SBIR program, STTR program, or NCATs in general. And then maybe we figured out let's give them some mentorship, and so we could get the advanced industry mentors. And now we've gotten even more sophisticated and said, oh, let's bring in consultants and teach them about the FDA process and the regulatory process, and maybe we can even bring in some more consultants and actually have the consultants do, quote, market research. But none of this particularly engaged the PIs personally in this process. It was all of the form of, if we talk to you enough, you could somehow theoretically understand this stuff, take notes, and magic will happen. The big idea we've had, particularly along NIH and translational medicine, is that's a mistake. Not a mistake that anybody's been dumb, but we now have another insight, and we'll talk later. We've run this as a prototype at UCSF, and it seems to be true, is that translational medicine now requires two parallel tracks. One is, obviously you want your science and technology to get better so it could actually be commercialized. But there's another track which you cannot outsource. Let me underline cannot. And that's the commercialization track. And there are two parallel tracks that we used to confuse and still confuse with one. The commercialization stuff also needs to be run by the PI. It's painful, it's hard. Most PIs think that's, and I don't mean this as a pejorative, but just a fact that that's someone else's problem. And it is if you want someone else to be getting the value out of commercializing your technology. But the successful ones are the ones who have engaged in the process. And the examples are many.
Before you go on to the examples, could we hear about the steps of customer development and how we actually would engage customers and what value we get out of that engagement when we leave the building? How do we translate that into something that's tangible, actionable, and that you can measure?
Sure. So, as I said earlier, the business model for example, therapeutics differs dramatically from business model for devices, for example. One of the things we've done with this whole lean startup theory is we've put it into practice in a class. Think of it as an incubator that we first taught at Stanford in the engineering school. Then the National Science Foundation adopted it for commercializing all science, called the Innovation Core. We ran a prototype for life sciences with 25 teams at UCSF last fall, and now starting next month, actually October 6th, so a month and a half, NIH is going to adopt it as well. We have 25 teams from NCATS, NHBLI, NCI, NNDIS. We're going to be running through the first class as well. And basically you take that theory, business model canvas, customer development, agile engineering, and you say the following. I want teams led by a PI who want to take their science and commercialize it. And the team is a PI, their best postdoc or graduate, and now these are funded companies or some company executive with a technical bent, and an industry mentor. They have to apply for the program. And basically, we're going to teach them how to turn their business idea into a series of hypotheses, teach them every week about one portion of the business model. What's a customer? What's regulation? How does reimbursement work? What are IP issues? And then every week, that team and all the teams need to get out of the building and talk to 10 to 15 customers, partners, regulators, reimbursers, etc. Come back the next week and in front of the other 25 teams and their peers, stand and deliver an 8-minute summary of what they learned. Repeat for 10 weeks. The last time a PI has stood in front of their peers and was their dissertation. And no one wants to be the PI who hasn't done the 10 to 15 interviews, because we have said, sit down. You haven't done your interviews. No one wants to be that PI. And so the peer pressure kind of works to the extent that what we're really trying to drive is to get enough data that's personally integrated by the team. Not, some proxy, but integrated personally. Because here's a key tenet that we've learned, is unless the founders, chief scientific officer, the technical officer, the principal investigator, is involved in this process, it doesn't stick. And the reason why is that, someone could come and say, well, we don't like the product, or the data's wrong, or whatever. And if you're the founder of the company, you'll go, they just don't get it. Or, you're talking to the wrong people. Or, we'll deal with it in another year, we got enough cash, it doesn't matter. But if you're personally talking to the head of research at Pfizer, who says, you don't understand, we got 12 of these in the pipeline, but too bad you're not doing X. They go, really, 12 in the pipeline? But too bad we've been doing X, we've put that on the shelf, we thought you weren't interested. Oh, we're desperate for that. Or, gee, it's too bad you haven't thought about this target, because, we're really thinking that actually might be something quite interesting. You go, our lab was kind of thinking about working on that as well. Does that help? Or?
Yeah, I was actually looking for the steps of the customer development process, perhaps elucidated by example within the life sciences, biotech, and perhaps an example outside. Maybe it'd be easier to start with a product that's physical rather than...
Sure. So the steps, you mean discovery, validation?
Exactly.
Right. So customer development process has 4 steps. The first one is customer discovery. And customer discovery is pretty simple. It says you have a series of hypotheses that we want you to go out and test. You believe you understand the customer problem, you believe you understand how to solve it, you believe you understand who the right people to call on. We want you to prove that that's the case. The next step is customer validation. And customer validation says, that's great, we'd like you to get an order. And in therapeutics, it might mean we want you to be on the path to get some collaboration deal within 18 months. The real surprise for me, by the way, is that at least my old model of what pharma looked like was obsolete about 5 or 10 years ago, because, as you all probably know, the pharma industry has completely changed their business model, where they all used to be completely vertically integrated. Half the pipeline is now coming from the outside in collaborations.
Or even more.
Depending on the... And that means huge opportunity for new startups, but unless you know how to do that collaboration, you're going to depend on proxies, or you're going to make some just incorrect assumptions about what's required to get those deals. And then the next steps is, if you think you have customer validation, then it's possible, then and only then, you want to scale. And that scale is called customer creation, and then eventually company building.
So would it be fair to summarize that customer discovery is hypothesis testing?
Yeah. So what's really interesting, and I will tell you, this is kind of a funny story, only funny in hindsight, is I put together this first class, which when taught at universities is called the Lean Launchpad, when taught for NSF and NIH is called the I-Course, same identical class. It was such a radical notion, believe it or not, because it was a replacement for the classic capstone class of how to create a business was how to write a business plan. And I now believe how to write a business plan still ought to be taught in universities, but probably in the English department, because it's the best example of creative writing you'll ever do. That is, the point was we were writing all this stuff kind of knowing that no one was actually, right? No venture capitalist actually reads business plans. They tell you to write them, but no one reads them. They might, refer to the income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow after they're done laughing. That's the VCs who are laughing up here. But what I did was, when I first put together this class at Stanford, I thought it was truly such a radical idea, and because I'm retired, this is what I do in my retirement, I open sourced the class. I blogged every class session thinking, maybe somebody's going to read this. And what I didn't realize, what was going on back in Washington, is the entire SBIR team, that is the investment team at the NSF, was reading this, because I got a call that went like this. Phone rang, I'm driving on the Stanford campus, I still remember where I was. Hi Steve, you don't know me, my name's Errol Arkulik, I'm the head of the SBIR program for the NSF, we're from the US government, we need your help. Now, because I'm still a smart ass at my age, my response was, the goddamn government got my help during Vietnam for 4 years, you're not getting it again. Errol still, I thought they wanted me for Iraq or Afghanistan, and I said, I'm not going, no. And they said, you ready for this? We're from the NSF. And I said, what's the NSF? And like you could hear, and Errol said he was holding the phone. Did we call the right guy? Who is this? And then he said, well, we read your class. We'd like you to, we think you've invented the scientific method for entrepreneurship. Well, then he got my attention, because I never would have made that claim. I said, what makes you say that? He said, look, your core of what you're doing is basically setting up hypothesis testing. This is a scientific method. Scientists know how to hypothesis test, and every other alternative to teach scientists about entrepreneurship require them to think like MBAs and know about sales and whatever. You're just setting this up as a series of science experiments that can be broken down and understood by people whose bent is running those experiments in a lab. You're in fact testing them, telling them that the only difference is they have to test hypotheses outside the building.
Right.
And by the way, as we discovered, the other distinction is the difference between an introvert and an extrovert with our PIs is whether they're staring at their shoes or your shoes. And we teach them how to make eye contact in 10 weeks. I mean, so that's the other contribution. But the NSF's got, and it's true. Because I used to be one of those people. But the NSF's interest was, Steve, can you put on a prototype of the class for us? And I said, great, I could fit you in next year. And they said in 90 days. And I went, who the heck am I talking to? This is the government? And it turns out I've gotten a huge appreciation of the type of people who work at the NSF and the NIH, is that they're incredibly aggressive. And we built this prototype class for them.
So you jumped ahead a little bit. Tell us about the I-Corps, but I want to return to customer development.
Okay.
Because customer development is comprised of steps, the first of which is testing hypotheses, customer discovery, and the next comes validation. And I'd like you to fill us in a little bit for those who are not familiar with your work and want to understand and outline the format of your process before they leave. But start with what is the I-Corps? When does it start? How does it work? And how is the NIH reaching out to people? How do we become involved in that?
Right. So the I-Corps started with the National Science Foundation adopting the Stanford class. Basically, for the NSF, it was scientists, principal investigators who had gotten an NSF grant in the last 5 years. PIs will put together and apply as a team, and basically they got a small grant to actually learn how to commercialize their science. And we put them through essentially this incubator boot camp, 25 teams at a time. It was a prototype. The results were pretty, I'd say, impressive to the NSF, such that they scaled it to 15 other universities. It's taught here in New York and NYU, City College, and Columbia, and then taught in Georgia Tech and Stanford and Berkeley and UCSF and U of M and others in DC. Johns Hopkins. And basically, we've now put 375 teams through the program. About a year ago, I got a phone call from the National Science Foundation after they put about 200 teams through the program that said, Steve, we need to stop the program and regroup. Now, to a marketeer, that's never like a good sign. Like, well, what do you guys mean? Well, we just looked at the data. Uh-oh, that's even worse. Uh-oh, like, well, why are you calling? Well, we thought we'd just let you know how we just changed the program. Okay, well, what did the data say? Well, well, no, there's the data right now. Sorry, guys. Is that it's the NSF call?
It's the government talking.
It's the government talking. It's maybe the NSA version of the program. But the NSF said we looked at the data, and as you know, for 30 years we've been running SBIR programs. Great. Well, what did you find? Well, for 30 years, 11% of the teams got SBIR grants. Okay. Somebody really must want to talk to me. What we just found out is that teams that went through the I-Core class, instead of 11%, got funded 68% of the time. Wow. 68%. So what are you guys going to do? We're now going to make talking to customers and having business model canvas and doing customer interviews an integral part of the SBIR program at the NSF. And that data started to get the attention of other government research institutions, much like the NIH. And so two things happened. One is we decided to run a prototype of the class, not for computer science and material science, but figure out if the same framework, business model canvas, customer development, and agile engineering, would work for very different domains. And we picked 4 domains. Could we make this work for therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, and digital health? And do it at UCSF, who was trying to drag me into modifying the curriculum for life sciences. And I said to UCSF, how smart I was, this will work for everything but life sciences. And the reason why I said that is my model of life sciences was some 1980s model that said it takes 10 or 15 years for investment in therapeutics and a couple $100 million, and you worry about customers at the end, and they nicely said, Steve, you need to get out of the building and talk to them. Truly, this was the UCSF story. And so Eric Liam, who's now at Mount Sinai, took me around to some of the venture capitalists, Alan May, who runs Life Science Angels on the West Coast, Carl Handelsman, who does therapeutics for CMEA, and others, who said, Steve, your model's wrong. In fact, the whole life science business model is changing. We desperately need something like this, not only to figure out how to be efficient about our investments, but also to be efficient about when we kill things. That is, being able to shut stuff down is equally important from an investment point of view as what to invest in. And then I talked to Brooke Byers and Larry Lasky and got the same answer. And so every time I would get that response from a VC, I'd say, great, you're now a co-instructor of the class. And so we got Alan May and Carl Handelsman and a couple others to kind of teach the class for us. And the results at UCSF by week 4 or 5 was so dramatic, we decided to take that data to the NIH and say, I think you ought to come out here and watch what's going on. This seems to be pretty effective.
So you made a very important point. Biotech is obviously one of the more expensive sectors in which to try to do business.
Yep.
Regulatory testing,
Yep.
trials, there's a lot of costs associated with it.
And worse is that there's been a flight of venture capital, if you haven't noticed, or you probably have, out of the area, because why should I be investing, waiting 15 years for return when social media will give me bigger returns in 3 years?
And for that reason, the stop points are very important, and I want to return to the steps of the customer development process. I have your diagram of the 4 steps of epiphany in my head with 2 stop points. Can you tell us about that and how we would make intelligent business decisions about, well, you know what, this isn't meeting the demands of a potential customer, or maybe it meets the demands of a subset, but it's not going to be a viable business or product?
So let me just tell you that generic key idea inside those steps and those stop points. It turns out that what we used to believe about building startups is that failure was bad. We try to avoid it at all costs. That is, we were executing per the plan, and any deviation of the plan was considered a failure. Let me give you an example. What would happen is, and I'll give you a non-life science example, we would raise money, we'd build the product, go through what's called alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, do what's called waterfall engineering. That is, spec the product and serially build it. We then ship, we'd high-five the VP of marketing, great press, and then the next board meeting we turn to the VP of sales and go, how are the numbers looking? And they'd say, great pipeline, which is short for not really well, but like, we're hoping it's going to be good. And that would repeat multiple times until the investors would get nervous and remove the VP of sales. The new VP of sales would come in, and she would look around and say, what a stupid sales strategy. That was the dumbest, can't imagine how anybody would do that. Here's the new strategy. Okay? That would continue for another 6 months to a year, and the company most often still wouldn't make the numbers. Guess what they do next? Any idea? Fire the VP of marketing, of course. Can't be the new head of sales, so let's fire someone else. New VP of marketing would come in and go, well, it's the positioning of the company, right? The slides are all wrong. Let's fire let's change the positioning. Repeat again for another 6 months or a year, depending how much cash, who gets fired next? CEO, of course. And if it's the technical CEO, he becomes the chief strategy officer. Ever see that one? But he's not actually running the company. And then you shut the company down. Guess what you were doing every time you replaced an executive? You were actually firing the plan. It's a big idea. The only time you were allowed to change the plan is when you fired an executive. It's a big, big concept. We assumed that the plan, the strategy, came from God because the venture capitalists or investors put money into it. Never once understanding that startups actually go from failure to failure. The only time we were allowed to make a substantive change to the business model was when we replaced an executive. The whole lean startup model turns that on its head. It says, you maybe have the wrong people, but more than likely, some parts of your plan are just simply incorrect. And so why don't we just make that a given? Is that you can make minor changes to the business model, and we'll call those iterations. That is, price from $1 number to another, or major changes to one portion of the business model called pivots. And a pivot is defined as a substantive change to one or more portions of the business model canvas. And a substantive change is, our target shouldn't be pharma, our target should be the government or something else. Or wait a minute, our sales model shouldn't be, through Johnson & Johnson. We should have a direct sales model. Right. That's a major pivot. Or, we shouldn't have direct sales. What are we, out of our mind? We should be like trying to sell this through Medtronic or some partnership. Those are typically used to be discovered at the end when large amounts of cash and time were burned. Now we just kind of assume that's an integral part of this process. Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, can you walk us through how we would actually put this into a tangible stop or go decision?
So
let's start at the beginning. So we have a technology.
Yep.
Perhaps we're in the I-Corps.
Right.
We're out talking to people.
Right.
We have our hypotheses, our predictions, and we have data. What do we do from there? And then how do we decide that we're needing a pivot or that we can just iterate a little bit?
So one of the nice things about the I-Corps is you have a teaching team with lots of experience and sitting back in the room who are both venture capitalists and domain experts. And so one of the things we kind of force the teams to do is start, measuring the outcomes of these experiments, is going, okay, were people excited? Do you have early indications of excitement? And by the way, to me, an early indication of excitement is money and commitment. I mean, everything else is just kind of, so are people like saying they're going to do a collaboration, or do you think, this device actually...
Do they want to buy it?
Do they want to buy it, or is there some customers or partnerships that look likely, or what kind of data do you have? And so every week we kind of review this data, and at the end, by the way, we've come up with something that we think has been very handy for both the NSF and the NIH, called the investment readiness level. And I don't know if you've seen that. Basically, one of the interesting things was the NSF was asking the teaching team for a thumbs up or down on what we viewed should be the next step for funding. And I thought that was, like, what kind of like gradation is that? On the other hand, if you've ever been to a technology demo day, it's kind of like, did they like your font and did you use a large voice when you were talking to the investors? So it was a little better than that. But I realized that for the last 20 or 30 years, NASA has come up with something called the technology readiness level, where there's actually a set of standards about, is your technology in a various different states of maturity. And we now use that to kind of rate the maturity of the technology. But there's now a way to kind of start rating the investment readiness level with the same kind of parallel thermometer. Have they validated the business model canvas? Do they understand, depending on the domain, let's take devices, do they understand regulation and reimbursement, and is this a 510K or PMA, or, what kind of trials do they need, and do they have partners identified, and now we could kind of rate them where they are. And by the way, throw in a number of what we think the team is. Is this a aggressive team? Are they smart? Do they have credibility? Do they have a great scientific advisory board? Are key opinion leaders on board, etc.? Does that?
Yes. So, in your book, The 4 Steps to Epiphany, you said that this model may not always be applicable, and the example you used was if there is a disease that can have a drug that would be resolved by that particular pharmacological intervention. You've now said that you can pivot.
Wrong.
But the same sort of issues about large scale of investment and expense, those play in. So how do we translate the prior understanding of drug development and very expensive bio research into something that's tangible and we can take advantage of?
So here was the surprise for me, though the VCs who were teaching it would have said they knew this already, was that I thought we were just going to, in fact, validate the commercial track and have no influence at all at the clinical side. And it turns out, of course, you get out of the building and you're now talking to people who are also doing, similar clinical work. They'll make some observations about, maybe you're looking at the wrong target, or maybe have you thought about, and where I said that this will have no effect on that, actually turns out to have, quite a bit of effect, because if the PI is listening to this feedback, they'll be thinking through their 10 or 15 years, 20 years of their own research, thinking, holy cow, I didn't realize that's commercially viable. Turns out some of the stuff, I'd say about half the time, that they have on the shelf is actually what ends up being productized, and that was a real surprise.
And I would add to that, it's also very good that you have the NSF, NIH involved, because the regulatory people also need to hear feedback from customers. A prime example that I've heard personally was in cancer drugs. There are drugs which have been denied approval because they didn't meet the metrics which are chosen, and yet they vastly improve quality of life, as an example.
Right, and so we're having I don't want to belabor the point, but another unintended consequence of the program is already engaging the FDA in a level that seems to be productive. That's
so hopefully. Kudos. We hope that regulatory processes will continue to get more aligned with translational medicine. How do you convince engineers and scientists that they do not have to build the perfect product to figure out whether it's good enough to be sold and for customers to try it?
Yeah, so this was a problem in the NSF teams, and certainly has been sometimes in therapeutics where people believe you need the final drug or something for phase 1 submittal to even have any type of collaboration. And it turns out it's just not the case. Is that people will not only engage in conversation with you, but people will actually engage in potential collaboration with you, because, as I said earlier, their business model has changed, and that's always a real surprise for a researcher. Is, you mean I could get some money and a deal now? And of course, it's that kind of validation that starts attracting investors. One of the problems we were trying to solve at the NSF and NIH is what's called the ditch of death problem. That is, the technology is kind of sufficiently of interest, but not enough of interest to a life science, even angel group, let alone venture capitalists, because the scientists can't yet talk the language of customers and regulatory issues and reimbursement issues. I got to tell you, after these 10 weeks, they could talk more about regulation and reimbursement and customer segments than a good number of the people sitting in that audience. And that's a dramatic change and that changes how fundable. It's a big idea. Let me, in fact, frame this. being able to understand a business model and being able to articulate it to a potential investor is a game changer for an academic. Huge. Doesn't change your science, doesn't change anything, but the minute you could kind of say, let me explain to you about the potential applications of this drug or device, let me tell you the 100 customers and partners and whatever we've just spoken to in the last 10 weeks, you've gone from a valuation of negative dollars to a valuation potentially of something substantial. Because you have done the translation that sometimes that investor cannot understand. And it doesn't guarantee funding, but I got to tell you, it guarantees a much different conversation on a very different level.
And you bring up a very important point about exposure and the necessity of communication and the way that you learn to communicate. Outside of your program where you have the peer pressure attribute, how do you get people to get out of the lab? There's only a certain number of slots in your program, and yet it sounds like communication is absolutely essential to the commercializability of pipelines that might end up in a translational research product.
That's a great question. I think events like this and organizations like this are a key part of it, but not every scientist wants to commercialize their technology, and
Sure.
not every scientist should be part of at least a founding team. They might be better suited to just be on the scientific advisory board or contribute on their technology. Being a founder of a technology startup requires a different set of skills than just being a great researcher and academic. And I don't mean better, I just mean different. And in fact, the line I use is you've got to be slightly insane to do it, because it requires you to take your research, which you understand its benefit, and being able to explain it to people who don't get it. And then being able to take criticism back about, and comments about, maybe it's wrong, or maybe the commercialization potential that you see really isn't there. And so, for example, at the NSF, I think only 1 out of 8 teams that apply get in, and we're going through the same thing at the NIH. I think for those 25 slots, we probably had 120 applications, and it's not just picking the best science. What we pick is the best science with the best team with the right attitude for commercialization. And the right attitude is very different from great science. The right attitude says, well, what happens if your hypotheses about commercialization are wrong? And if you're not willing to take that feedback, it's the wrong model this isn't the only model to build a company, but this is the one we use, says you have to get feedback and hear it and process it. It might piss you off. But once that's over, you got to go, well, now what do I do with that information? Does that make sense?
If you don't want to fail, it's a good idea to listen to data before you go down that route.
It's a painful process. How many of you have done a startup? Right? How many of you have been in a startup that failed? Yeah. So these are the people who understand what the downside is about, being an entrepreneur. It's a pretty miserable process. As I say, only crazy people tend to do it more than once. And if you're a serial entrepreneur, you're certifiable. I also remind people that the most successful entrepreneurs, actually in Silicon Valley, I stopped asking this when I probably crossed 1,000 students giving me feedback. Actually, about half of the successful CEOs come from dysfunctional families. And the reason why is, and for those of you taking note on that, it's because these are people who've actually grown up with chaos and managed to successfully manage changing conditions that change rapidly, sometimes day to day. It's a very cruel training process, but actually
Highly effective.
Highly effective in building CEOs who deal with the constant change and chaos of an early stage venture. It also explains, if any of you have ever worked for these people, why they are actually destructive when they find a repeatable model and their company's ready to scale, is they don't want a repeatable process, and so they tend to throw hand grenades, physical and emotional, into their own companies to keep the chaotic situations going, which is when venture capitalists have to deal with, how do I remove these people, because while they got us here, they're actually going to destroy the value they've created. But for those of you who do fall under that category, you do have a competitive advantage for a while.
So I'll throw in one story, and that is how I try to encourage scientists to consider the commercializability of their research or what they're working on. And at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which is a pretty prestigious place, the rate at which postdocs are offered a professorship is 20%, or that's
Wow.
generous. That's generous.
Wow.
So 0.2. And what's the median rate of grant acceptance, approval, granting? Any ideas? You guys must know this number. Yeah, 7 is actually right. So let's round it off and call it 0.1. So you need about 2 grants to have a sustainable laboratory. So 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.2, you now have a 0.2% chance of success. Now that is a wrong calculation. You actually need the binomial distribution to account for the number of grants, etc. But when you juxtapose 0.2% to the expected value of gambling, every gambling game that you can go to in a casino has a better expected rate of return than our academic process, and that.
So it's kind of like
Raises some
startups.
eyebrows.
If you really think about startups in Silicon Valley, over 90% of them fail. It's a big idea. 90% of them fail. And the real surprise for me, even when I retired, because like, you get on an airplane knowing that 90% of them won't make it across country, but we did it anyway, is that almost all of them fail, not for the fact that the technology fails, but they fail from a lack of customers and market. Now, this is a big idea. So in Silicon Valley, we're probably taking more technical risk, and maybe San Diego for life sciences and Boston, than anywhere else in the country. But it's not the technology that usually fails. It's, in fact, we haven't found the business case for the scale. Yet we had no processes to manage, the customer part, which is where customer development came in.
And you talked also about people, about the team, right?
Right.
You have to have the right team. How do you see the differences and similarities between tech founders and biotech founders? What makes a founder of a life science or a biotech company successful, or medical devices or whatever? Talk some about the characteristics here.
So the good news is, given I'm talking to this group, is that they're smarter. Is that I've noticed that actually, and this is no joke, one of the reasons we went to NIH in the middle of the UCSF class is that the scientists and the researchers who took the class at UCSF did a substantively better job at customer discovery and hypothesis testing than any other domain. And we were teaching the cream of the crop at the NSF. In fact, 2 of the teams, one was headed up by Hobart Harris, the head of surgery at UCSF, and the other was Mike, I'm blanking on his last name, who was the inventor of fetal surgery, who had been around for a long time. And when I went, how come you guys are like jumping into this thing so quickly? They said, Steve, in medicine, we half the time we don't know what we're doing either. It's all about hypothesis testing. It's an integral part about what we think about as surgeons or researchers, as doctors. Right. It's not some known physics problem. Right, we're still kind of making it up. And so hypothesis testing is part of our excuse the pun, our DNA. And so I have found that people in this domain actually are great at this stuff. I mean, once you get past the ego part of I can't be wrong, and that's again the filter of being able to do this process.
Take the feedback.
Right. Not only take the feedback, going, damn, is it possible that like it is the wrong target, or these are the wrong target, or what do you mean the FDA isn't going to approve, or I need a PMA? Can we make it a 510K or something? You get really, really good at this. I mean, really, that's why the NIH is excited. Not because, by the way, not because this is the process. There is no the process. This is an A process. And it's a process that seems to be more effective than the last process. But for God's sake, there will be more processes, hopefully, in the next couple of years that will build on top of this one and be much better. But I'd say for now, this seems to be one of the ways to be incredibly efficient. And as I said, it won't work for anybody. It won't work for everybody. If you believe that, your stuff is right and it's just an execution problem, you should go try that. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's mandatory, but it seems to be the right way right now.
And aside from intelligence, what about biotech and tech or other entrepreneurial activities is different?
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to now flip your question. What I find interesting is that the funding environment is radically different.
Sure.
And if I could talk about that for a second, the venture survivors who are still funding life sciences, meaning biotech and devices, are incredibly amenable to this process because they're looking for anything that could efficiently help companies identify markets and customers as rapidly as possible. That was the other surprise to me, was finding that the adoption, my instructors are venture capitalists who like spent some time and went, this is going to, like, yeah, why wouldn't we want to do this?
Sure.
So, for example, Carl Handelsman, who was investing in therapeutics for the last 15 years, believes this could, decrease the amount of funding required by a factor of 10 for therapeutics. Not that you won't eventually need that cash, but you could eventually get partnerships and deals much earlier in the process than
Or
you could,
stop on a bad path.
or stop on a bad, that was Brett Byers' thing, is that we need to kill these things before
Right.
we start feeding them hundreds of millions of dollars and sucking up funds. And by the way, the nice part is that what we found at UCSF is that the teams themselves at the end of the program will say, we shouldn't go on with this project. That's really interesting. Instead of a venture capitalist having to tell them, they'll self-identify because we make them, while we're giving them our investment readiness level number, the first thing we need to do...
doing it internally.
No, we make them, as their last slide, present their self-assessment of where they are in investment readiness.
And how well do they match?
There was only one team that was more than one away.
I see.
On a scale of 1. Well, because it's no secret. We tell them what the criteria are.
What was the scale? 0 to 10?
0 to 9.
9. Okay. Yeah. 10.
And so we make them do it, and all of a sudden, when they understand the criteria, no one's dumb. They could go, well, yes, have we done these things? And then you say, do you want to spend the next 3 or 4 years, even if we gave you infinite cash? And surprisingly, the right people kind of said no. That was kind of exciting.
What else was surprising about the classes?
I was, as I said, the biggest surprise for me was how well this worked for life sciences. Maybe because I came from the world convincing myself that this is the one place where it would never work.
Uh-huh.
And the second was how amenable the business model canvas was to create a therapeutics business model versus a devices business model versus an informatics business model.
Sure.
And so how easily this process can be translated to these different domains. And it didn't require much work. One of the things I did when we went back through the class, because we do a postmortem after each one, was I decided that the way we're going to teach it for the NIH was in a slightly different order. That is, instead of spending all the time thinking about distribution channel and how to create demand, we were very quickly going to get into, IP and regulation and clinical trials, which is, for life sciences, much more important than some of those other components.
Absolutely.
But besides that, the rest was kind of identical with the NSF classes.
So did you find that it was easier teaching to a technical community, a scientific community, where hypothesis testing is our bread and butter?
I teach this class in both business schools and engineering and medical schools, and I probably, in order of preference, is teaching in medical schools, teaching in engineering schools, and then, business school students, think they're masters of the universe by default. And I find it a lot easier to teach someone who has a core technical idea how to think like a business person than ever to try to have a business person create some, technical idea. It doesn't mean that business people can't come up with ideas, but the odds of them coming up with technical ideas is pretty close to zero. Now, by the way, a great combination of teams as you get further along is, when do you insert the business expertise?
Of course.
But the key idea here, and it's something you should all think about, is what this class does is train scientists to think like business people. And because you're going to be getting out of the building and talking to potential customers, even though that's not going to be your job the rest of your career, you're going to go back to your lab or you'll send your grad students out to start the company, they and you will never, ever, ever be bullshitted by a head of sales or marketing in the rest of your careers. And in fact, if you have to be involved in hiring one, your conversations are going to go like this: is, well, we closed the first deals with Merck and Pfizer. What are you going to do for us? Well, imagine that kind of conversation. that's a lot different
Position.
because it changes this like opaque black box of what does sales and biz dev do and how do they work and what do they do and whatever. You've just done it for 10 weeks. And you know what? Let's agree, you never want to have to do that again. But now you understand.
Absolutely.
There's no magic to it. There's no like they have their own language and their own buzzwords and whatever. But you can understand that process.
Sure. So I want to ask one more question, and then we're going to open up to the audience.
Yep.
Do you guys have lots of questions? Raise
No
your hand.
questions? Some questions?
Raise your hand if you got questions.
Oh, good.
Okay, we good. So the last question I've got prepared is, what about the future? Obviously, our capacity has to increase. There are organizations like NYC Bio that reach out to the scientific community and bring them together with the business community.
Yeah.
But we obviously have a huge need exemplified by our budget.
So the real missing part is risk capital to match life science creativity. It used to be in the so just if you understand the ecosystem, government funding for research in the U.S. last year was about $120 billion. I don't remember the number, but like, I don't know, 40 or 50 billion went directly to research universities who also got another 10% from state and local governments. That generates some number of patents per year, et cetera. And the venture capital community spends about $25 billion a year funding companies. And it used to be that the country was aligned between what we funded and what venture capital actually funded as startups. In the last 10 years, our national interests have become unaligned.
Right.
We're funding still medicine and science and materials and computer science and lots of interesting stuff, and the VCs have gotten distracted. They're now spending a good chunk of that.
Which is absolutely essential. So how do we bring them on board? We have 5 VCs within the audience.
Right. So I'm going to tell you, one of the things we did is we got tired of waiting, so we started a venture capital firm. We, the head of the NSF SBIR program, left and started M34 Capital, and we're going to start funding and start funding the output of the I-Corps. Because we think we have an unfair advantage, is that we now have trained those teams to kind of understand customers and markets and whatever,
Sure.
and we've been writing checks. I've been writing personal checks, and now been writing through the funds, and Life Science Angels in California, Alan May is one of the instructors, chairman of it, and now he's focused on bringing this process into Life Science Angels. So I think we're going to start figuring out how to make the life science venture community efficient and demanding the right set of answers when they have scientists in front of them. Is yes, you could invest in the pure technologies. My friend Larry Lasky's only criteria is there a paper in Cell, Nature, or Science, and there's a good target, and I'll invest. Or you could say, gee, when they stand up in front of me, can they talk about the number of customers they've spoken to, and can they speak our language? Because we can now train them to do that, and therefore the deal flow is smarter and maybe richer in bridging that gap. And so we're trying to do that as well. Now, just imagine in board meetings if venture capitalists start asking, so how many of these hypotheses have you tested, right? And so we're also trying to change the VC language. Instead of like, where are you on the plan? Tell me about the partners. Tell me about the collaborations we're going to do and how we do it in that.
So perhaps it would be fair to say we're moving away from style, creative writing, to substance, i.e. I talked with 20, 50, 100 people.
With venture capital involved, we'll never completely move away from style, but and I say that in a very polite way, but I think we could now get substance engaged on both sides of the conversation. I think there just used to be this bright line between I'm a technologist, here's my technology, will you fund it, I got this great paper,
right.
And I think there might be a business here versus can we move the scientists to have part of the conversation to VCs who now need to get engaged as well in that same way.
Excellent.
Okay.
At that, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Who's got a question? Go ahead.
Who in a healthcare-related technology, who are the customers? I mean, who's a typical customer? It's not direct to consumer.
No, well,
So
some of
who
them
are
are.
the
So digital health might be direct to consumer, but for therapeutics, it's the pharmas, and for devices, you could either decide you're going to start a company or you're going to start one to be acquired, or you could start one with a partnership. In diagnostics, same way, and so it kind of depends. We've seen all kinds of models. I'm not sure.
Okay. I mean, like doctors?
Well,
No, like many things in law or business, it depends.
No, but specific. So I think now I understand your question. So it turns out that one of the interesting things for me was thinking about a therapeutics company that has a cure for a potential cure for pick some oncology problem. You would think that the customer is the patient. Turns out that's not the customer at all. I mean, that's the end customer. But gee, the distinction is the business is the customer is eventually you're going to get a partnership and or acquired by some kind of pharma company. And unless you understand that distinction, that is, yes, there's an end customer, but there's actually a business customer, you're going to be focused on thinking you're building a drug for grandma, where in fact you're building a drug for Pfizer.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That was a big idea or classic is, when I get young students who medical device, who's the customer? Oh, it's my grandmother who needs the new hip. Really? Can she put the device in herself? Well, no, I guess doctors are involved. Great. Are they the customer? Sure. Oh, can they put any device in? Oh, no, I guess somebody has to approve them. Well, who's that? Oh, that's the FDA. Oh, are they part of the customer? Yes. So is grandma paying for this hip with her credit card? No, I guess insurance. Well, is insurance a customer? Well, oh, that's interesting. Well, wait a minute, And so now what we've discovered is devices, for example, are a multi-sided market, meaning there are many people you need to address, but at the end, gee, is the goal to solve that problem, or is the goal, do you want to be acquired, or do you want to be a standalone company, or do you... Now we have some really interesting conversations going on. And by the way, clinical trials, now you need to understand partners. Does that?
Yeah,
So we teach all that stuff to a scientist who said, no, but I have this new material for this hip. No, it's a little more complicated than that. And that's kind of fun. Why? Because once you teach it a couple of times, there's no magic here. There's a repeatable process of trying to understand how this works, and then you could explain this fairly easily without having to think about sales and marketing, biz dev. This is a repeatable education process.
Next question in the back.
Yeah, so it's really something you're part of, in the tech space. You see the angel more traction first before they'll invest more time in the experience. Also, there's a lot of brand for traction. I'm curious if you have your assets or people think they want to go to is that you're anything as well? And so, do you have tips for how to make website and identify how to get that?
What kind of company?
MedTech.
Could you repeat the question? Can't hear you.
Yeah, can you repeat that? How do you get SBIR funding? Was that the question?
Well, your understanding
That
is
sounds like a trick.
Yeah, that's a good question.
without customers, without customer traction to show to like a VC or any investor, brand.
Let me give it a shot. Without substantial market traction, which proves to a VC that you're a viable company, how do you get funding? And it was suggested to you to go through an SBIR because they don't require the market proof of customers.
Yes. Um, so, without giving you specific advice, the SBIR path is one way to get funding. But the things I've just been describing, the process of actually getting out of the building and starting to talk to people in a formal process, is not something that costs a lot of money. It's a big idea. You don't need to go through the I-Corps program to do what we just suggested. And it actually changes the conversation you could have with angel investors starting tomorrow. Right now, if you say, I have some great tech, my first question is, who cares? And if you can't answer that, who cares? Shame on you, because it doesn't cost you any dollars to at least have that first level conversation where you can now come back and say, Steve, Well, who cares? I got a bunch of people who care, but now here's what they want to see, either in data, in the therapeutic, or they want to see a prototype of the core technology. Now I need some funding. Well, that's an interesting conversation, because now you have said I at least took it to that level, past just I have a great idea or a great piece of tech. Does that help?
Let's put those numbers as your customer validation.
Well, I don't think it's validation. I think it's enough to at least engage a potential investor who then would say, well, that's kind of interesting. You have these kind of interactions. Have you talked to these people? And now the conversation is just more past, I have a good idea. My dog has a good idea, and I don't even have a dog. I mean, what I mean is, you now, just thinking this through, could say, oh, what could I do with just a credit card? And it is the beginning of which parts of the business model, and by the way, if you talk to who are the investors here? Raise your hand. Come on, seriously. They will tell you, right, if you grab them before they leave, there's only one door here, okay? Not whether they'll give you money, but what's the criteria for having a basic conversation with an investor? And I'm sure this stuff is on the line here as well. Don't come to us unless you have a paper in X or Y, or it's great if you have a paper in X and Y, and after we've spoken to these, end people. Is that fair? Right? Yeah? No? Yeah?
I think it's better to go about finding out what people need before investing in developing technology down the
This is great. So so the question is, should I start on the technology side looking for customers,
Right.
or should I start with customer needs and then fulfill it with technology? In a perfect world, that's what you'll start with. In a perfect world, you will spend the time and do what it's called design thinking. Or Paul Yock at Stanford wrote a textbook called Biodesign. Has anybody seen that for medical devices? And Paul starts with customer needs. If you have the time and energy and whatever, that's how Tom Fogarty made all his money. Fogarty was a surgeon, stood in the operating room and said, well, damn, we're using forks. Maybe we should stop using forks and have some specific instruments. You could do that, and that's actually a very efficient approach for corporate design. But so the answer is yes. In a perfect world, that's where I would start with. The interesting thing is most of the NSF and NIH people we deal with started like I did. That's nice, but I just invented something. Is there a customer for my invention? And so this customer development process works on either end. We tend to start with assuming people have invented something and are now looking for product market fit on customers. You could start from the other end, which is I found a need. Now let me see if I could build some products that match it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. In the back.
Do you sell the things to worry about the size of the market?
All the time. So from day one, we make them do what's called total available market, potential shared available market, what can we get, etc., just to make sure you're not running an experiment on a $5 million business. I mean, you might decide that it's a $5 million business and it's fine, but you better be running a reagent business out of your lab where it gives you great income, but it's not worth quitting your day job for. So the answer is sure. So in the back of your head, you need to know what scale am I of the problem I'm trying to solve. Did that answer your question? Or okay? Yeah.
How do you kind of respond to Steve Jobs as a
It's a great question. Right, now ask the question. No. Can I ask the question for you? So there's a Steve Jobs and Henry Ford quote. All the same is, Henry Ford said, like, if I gave customers what they wanted, it would be a horse with 6 legs. Or Steve Jobs saying, I never asked customers, blah blah blah. Right, and it turns out those are great questions because what did they do? It turns out that one of the things that's not been clear is that there are multiple types of startups, all with the same word called startup. There's a startup in an existing market. An existing market means I could show you as a customer a device and you say, oh, it's one of those. Is yours better? How's it better? And so the market's understood, You could do customer discovery by asking people what kind of features they want. And by the way, they'd also always give you the list, and then they tell you they want it half the price and whatever. And those are some nice businesses. You do discovery very simply. But there's another type of startup where, in fact, it's a disruptive startup. It's going to create something new that's never existed before. You go out and ask people about this new idea and what kind of features, they don't even understand the planet you're on. It's like, it's never been, so the type of customer discovery you do in an existing market is very different than customer discovery you do in a new one. But unlike jobs, you don't sit with, in a Zen Lotus position with lightning bolts coming out of your head. You actually are trying to understand what the day in the life of the customer looks like now versus what would have to change and what changes. So it's a different type of discovery. Does that make sense so far? Turns out there's a third type of market where it is an existing market, but you're going to do something called resegment the market. It's when ultrasound machines went from big, things to kind of portable ones. The market changed because now all of a sudden you were going after a niche of users, or they could be low-cost entries. And then there's a fourth type of startup, which is if you're building it outside the U.S., you clone an existing U.S. business model. No, it's adapt and adopt is a polite term for steal, which are pretty popular in both China and Russia, and some of the EU business models are simply take a U.S. one, doesn't guarantee success, but kind of guarantees that it worked over here. I got to understand local laws and customs, etc. Does that answer your question? And so, as an investor, you got to keep asking. By the way, the sales curves are different. The amount of capital you need are different. The time frame that you need is different. So that's why I keep, like, one of the other tests we do is, so are you going after an existing market or a new market? If it's a new market, you and your investors better be aligned it's new, because they might be saying, where's the revenue in year 2? And you're going, but this was a 10-year investment. And they're going, we didn't get that memo. We thought you were, does that? All right. Others. Right there.
I'm going to caveat this by saying I don't know anything about science or biotech. My understanding is that high-tech startups like that can have much higher development costs and also greater variability in the development costs. As in your new venture firm that's focused in this area, how are you addressing that, and to what extent does your research?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
As an investor who's making investments in new technologies that are coming from academics,
Right.
I'm imagining that some of these technologies could have very high development
Sure,
costs.
just like anything else. So the only difference about investing in lean startups or whatever is not how much capital these things might need over time. I don't think they change substantially. The real neat trick is when they need the capital. That is, what we're doing is being capital efficient up front. Do we have enough data? Rather than raising $40 million in the first round, we can now say, well, here's the evidence we want to see. And in fact, we call this, when we invest, evidence-based entrepreneurship. We actually could set some fairly concrete goals about what kind of evidence do we want. Now that gets distorted when there's theater and, when it's a hot market and whatever. We're in no danger of that in this segment, at least right now. But it's about being capital efficient and knowing when to double down and knowing when to be efficient. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple friends in particular that have started high-tech firms. They came out of academia and then they needed millions of dollars, and it was almost like it seemed like it was binary for them. Like you can either build this MVP and it will cost this huge amount of money or not.
Right. We'll talk about that if we have time. And then, all right. Question?
Yeah. The hidden agenda in all this discussion really, perhaps not so well hidden, actually, is how do you attract smart money
Yes.
to your particular thing that you're trying to do?
Yes.
And you point out the disparity between how much is spent by NIH and government in hundreds of millions of billions of dollars, as opposed to how much goes to the VCs and how they don't spend it in that area. And it seems to me that very much along the line that you were talking about, it relates to the front-end capital. And if you're going to try and work on alternative energy, as guys did in Silicon Valley, much to their displeasure because they found they couldn't make any money, or with pharmaceuticals where you don't need capital in that sense of making huge things, but you do need to spend a lot of time and a lot of money for developing the process,
Yep.
or perfecting the process, and taking it through the regulatory, which is
Yep.
getting to be more and more of a mess
Yep.
all the time. And you try to compare that to writing code.
Yep.
You write code, if you're successful, you have something like Yap or Whisper, and thousands of people come there and give you their money, and well. And if it doesn't work, you just take that code and that piece of paper, you put it in the garbage can, and that's it. How are you ever going to make pharma or alternative energy or something like that competitive in comparison to writing code? This is not to say that people won't do those, but it will have to be a rather small amount relative to the others when people are so eager to tell other people their secrets.
So that's a great question, and that's more of a policy question, and I'm going to give you an answer. So, but mostly above my pay grade, so I'm going to give you my opinion anyway. And there's two components to what you just asked, which is, as entrepreneurs, where do we want to spend our time and careers, right? Anybody here want to move into software? Feel free to do that. But I don't think you're here in life sciences and devices or pharma or whatever because you want to go make a gazillion dollars. And I got to tell you, my career in Silicon Valley was never, how can I make the most amount of money? I did it because I loved what I did. I couldn't imagine that people were actually paying me money to show up for work and go do this, and you get this stock stuff at the end. I don't think this is going to change who's taking jobs in pharma or devices or whatever. The real question you're asking is, how do we incentivize investors to play in a space where there's a lot more money to be made elsewhere? And that's where government policy needs to catch up with the reality of it's more profitable to be over here, and we never had to provide incentives. And that's really tough in this political environment because, we tried one experiment of the government directly funding energy startups, and, we have found that the political system, at least now, doesn't have the stomach for the failures that occur across a portfolio. Turns out the government actually made a ton of money, if you think about it, but politics plays a game of gotcha that says I can't have a portfolio that fails 9 out of 10 companies, even though the 10th made all the money. Well, private capital, that's in fact the norm. It's okay. You don't get punished for those. So we might have to change the tax code or give tax incentives to actually change what the country needs for investment. And I think it will probably take another administration to go do that. So I'm above my pay grade. But you should understand, even in this administration, we've been working with the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy that has a pretty smart guy named Tom Khalil running the U.S. National Innovation and Entrepreneurship Policy. And we've started some really interesting programs. Besides I-Corps, the GSA now has something called F-18. There's now something called the Digital Services Playbook. There's now, you can now do lean projects inside the government. And there's a contracting manual to do this. So it's not like the government is being obtuse to this. It's just difficult. And you've articulated, I think, a real problem. I think it's not going to change what we want to do as with our careers. We just need to figure out how to get the risk capital here in scale that we used to have.
I'm going to add one.
Seems to me that what you're seeing is a trivialization of development.
I don't think it's trivialization.
Maybe that's excessively saying.
I think what's happened is the commoditization of development. Unlike life sciences, it's now 1,000 times cheaper to start a software company than it was when I was in business. Computing has turned into utility. For those of you not familiar with it, Amazon Web Services is like they have, servers worth hundreds of millions of dollars that individually none of us could afford, but it's like none of us could afford a power plant either, but we plug it into the wall, we kind of take for granted electricity, we now take for granted computing that never used to exist. The same thing is, these methodologies we're talking about in lean have their most impact in software, where all of a sudden I could get a minimum viable product that is prototyped out within weeks on a credit card, where it used to take me years with a waterfall development process. So the game has changed dramatically in software just because cost of entry is now available to anybody worldwide with a laptop. It's a big idea. Right now we don't have life sciences down to that scale. We might in another 5 or 10 years, maybe. But that's what's creating these opportunities. It's not just the trivialization, it's in fact the number of developers, and more interestingly, anybody with these is now a consumer of software. There's 1 billion of these. It's a big idea. There were 0 of these.
Actually, there's 1.29 billion in China of those alone.
Right.
I want to add.
Does that help? I didn't mean to.
I want to add 2 things to that, though. Life science and biotechnology is intrinsically a science of things. When you have a phone, that's what you need for software, right? On a phone you can do patents, you can do film, you can do books, you can do software. All of those require a Starbucks and a cell phone. Maybe we'll get a keyboard. But the second point, actually Steve touched on, and it's even more important. As scientists, I think, as people in the life science field, we have, I think, a responsibility to communicate, and to communicate not only our passion, but the values behind why we do what we do. And I don't think that as scientists, as a group, as a generalization, we have done a good enough job telling people, this is why you should spend money on science. This is why this research is important. If you ask a lot of people, they will say, not everyone, but they'll say, science, that's kind of good. But if you ask them, would you support a tax increase so that you can do more science? The answer is no, until their kid, aunt, father, whoever gets sick. And then the answer is, why don't you have a cure for this? Right? So, and there are tax incentivizations for orphan disease. So I think we made something. I just want to emphasize that communicating as science and people in the life science field is a part of moving in the direction to addressing.
It'll come around to us again. So
we should move on, though. I apologize.
Question in the back.
Boring you with this, so I won't anymore.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Nicole McKnight. I'm a postdoc at Mount Sinai and a co-founder of Film. And I read your article recently on Catherine Gould, pioneering women in VC. I was wondering if you could talk about the problems that we have with the lack of women CEOs and also the low percentage of VC funding for women-led ventures.
Well, since Catherine Gould was one of my mentors, I guess I'm kind of biased, for women in technology. I'm just simply unqualified to do many comments. In fact, my TA became one of the best women VCs, Anne Miraco at Floodgate. Women have historically been incredibly underrepresented. And there's a great debate, as you're probably aware of, about how to get more women in the pipeline. It's not just women CEOs, but where do they come from? And what's their representation in the sciences? And it goes all the way back to women in STEM education, and what kind of job are we doing for that? And I've been working with the NSF. Stanford has a program called Epicenter, which is pioneering STEM education for undergraduate level, which has a large focus on getting women engaged. And so the answer is fairly complicated, as I said, above my pay grade, but I've been engaged because I have 2 daughters on multiple levels.
So in life sciences, at the postdoc level, we're very good because we maybe more
Really?
women than men as therapeutic postdocs.
Wow.
We see this number, 77% of startups come from postdocs and grad students. And, I'm just wondering where you see the discord.
Well, you should know and maybe you do, it's a hot issue in Silicon Valley. I think it's gotten the attention of a bunch of VCs. I know for a fact it's gotten the attention of NSF. We're trying to, in fact, you could help. We're trying to get Catherine engaged as being a role model for the next generation of women CEOs who were fairly scarce when I was an entrepreneur. That's the best I could say about it. And in fact, happy to talk with you offline about the subject. Other questions? Yes.
And my question was, coming back a bit to the earlier discussion we have, I think that it is very interesting to combine ideology with software development.
Well, that's the whole informatics business.
In my case, I started a company in agricultural genomics, and my most interesting collaboration are with computer scientists and electrical engineers. So just went to them, this is the biological problem, try to solve, and I need computer to make it faster, so we can solve it in a more creative way. And I see this when you have intersections
Yep.
between different disciplines, really interesting things come out, and you start the company with one vision, and because of this intersection, you realize you go a totally different way. Because,
Completely agree.
yes.
Yeah. Other comments? You want to pick?
Doesn't matter, go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank John and his team for putting this thing together. My name is Robbie Small.
They're much better than this one.
Yeah. I graduated from this great institution 28 years ago, and spent a lifetime in the pharmaceutical industry. Most of my years in Pfizer, and I worked on got generations of. And having said all of that, I started a company 3 months ago because the company that I was working until recently decided to shut down R&D. Okay, so finally, having spent a lifetime in discovering drugs, I decided to start a company on my own. And my question is this, if you are chasing smart money, losing money or interest money, and you have IP that differentiates from, prestigious to playoff, okay, and then if your IP is positioned to make a difference in an area that has a significant unmet mental need, where do you go with, having, in that sort of situation, how do you go about chasing the smart money?
Wow, that's a...
And also I want to add something to it, and having you yourself as a brand, because having spent a lifetime, starting a company, making yourself as the brand to start a company.
Well, that's a good question. So any of the investors want to chime in about where you would go with great IP or how to... Anyone?
SBIR.
I'm sorry?
SBIR first.
SBIR first?
Great IP doesn't make great company, unfortunately. I have to tell you that. So great IP is a good way to start. With great IP, I'll try to do everything I can before going to investors. And not chasing them, but actually giving them an idea as to value proposition for the company. But if you can work while we have just that, try to get non-dilutive funding until we can build a company around what we have. Which is great.
I think that's great advice. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
How do you, you talk to the customer, you get up to speed, and the world changes as you're doing the development. How do you keep talking to that customer so they still feel it's worth going forward when the environment changes?
Give me an example. What do you
Well,
mean?
the example is, let's say there's a new medical protocol that is issued, and the product you're working on is set for the old protocol.
Well, assuming that you were solving a high-value problem, the customers will likely still want to engage, because that protocol applies to them and other companies trying to solve the problem. What's really interesting I've found is that this whole customer development process is not sales. It's a big idea. Even though it feels like sales and looks like sales, let me give you the bounding box of what it's not. It's not sales, and it's not a giant focus group. Right? Those are the two things it gets confused at. By sales is, I want to push this out to you and convince you to use it. The types of people you're going to be engaged with early on are those who, in fact, have vision almost as good as you, who either have a need or can see what you could solve for them that's a real and present problem, either now or coming. So if the environment changes and they were thinking it was a transaction, they're going to go away. If in fact the environment changes and they have a need, the need is still there. Now there are different rules and they'll work with you. And that's the difference between a sale and a relationship in an early stage venture. And for a focus group, what I mean is you're not collecting a feature list that grows longer every time you talk to yet again another customer. Because again, you're looking for those early collaborations and partnerships. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, sir.
How does a technology startup company respond to a potential significant customer that says, I really like your idea, but
Right.
you're just a startup, and how do I know you will be around to deliver?
So are you funded or not?
No.
Okay. No, it really depends, because I've had that when I was venture funded. I just gave them the list of, how big my VC's fund was, and, the VC would lie through their teeth saying they were going to fund me forever. But seriously, this goes back to this idea here of this is not a sale. It's a relationship. If in fact that the relationship can't get past, that they need you enough, if you could deliver this, nothing you say right now is going to win. You could say, I'll put my IP in a mayonnaise jar in the bank, and if we go out of business, you can own it, and blah, blah, blah. But at the end, they have to decide that risk-reward trade-off of dealing with an early-stage venture is worthwhile. And if you haven't made that case, or they're not desperate enough, it's not going to happen. And by the way, those rules kind of change as you get more funding. Then all of a sudden, you have more runway for them to see. And I don't know if anybody else has. Do you have feedback on that, or no? Okay, but if anybody else has any, but that's been my experience. And this brings up something else I'll just mention, and it may or may not be true in the life sciences, but it's been true in every other domain. When I was in a startup, I always used to think that the people who would be most excited by something new or disruptive were the market leaders, right? The number one company in the business should obviously want my technology. It turns out, and again, I can't speak for life sciences, but it turns out that was almost always wrong. Anybody know why?
Human psychology, they got their system rolling.
They're the market leaders. They're not desperate. But in fact, it turns out that number 2 through 4 in the marketplace, who at least were heading in this direction, who wanted to be the market leader, would take some bets that the market leader just wouldn't take. And so here I was banging my head, and in this case trying to call an Intel, when AMD threw themselves at us and said, hey, well, how big of a check would you like? And you went, well, you guys are losers. Why would I want to? Oh, look at that check. I went, duh, that was an IPO right there. But just getting over and in fact, they were, they would keep writing checks because they needed to catch up. And that's kind of, I think, probably works in this industry as well. Don't fall in love with, these are the smartest guys, and look, they have the best scientists and whatever. I actually created a logo once for a company in Latin that when translated said, if you weren't effed up, you wouldn't be our customer. And I shipped that for years until I found one of the customers actually read Latin. And they said, does this really say what we... I don't know who did that. Does that answer another part of your question in the back?
Yeah, on that issue of credibility, in life sciences, what's your guidance for the minimum viable asset needed to have credibility with your customer discovery?
Yeah. So in life sciences, typically no different than any other market. You need to create a reality distortion cloud around your company. Typically in the life sciences case, there's formal names for that. You need a great scientific advisory board. You need some key opinion leaders. You need to start talking at conferences and getting on speaking things. You need to you or your cloud need to be kind of credible in your domain. And you could create that as an engineered process. Who's the therapeutics company that's now showing up in the diagnostic company? The woman who's showing up in every article now? Oh, yeah. I don't know what your opinion is, but if you look at her board of directors doesn't have anybody who even can spell the word science. But it's Henry Kissinger. It's whatever. All of a sudden it's wow, they must know something. Well, what do they know? They know how to take aspirin in the morning. I mean, and Viagra at night. But I mean, but did I answer your question or?
Is this study one? I mean, is there something specific you need to have a level of credibility?
It depends. So I'm trying to be generic because it depends on your industry and your segment and whatever. In devices, you need different people than you need therapy. What field are you in?
I did a digital health app.
Yeah. So digital health is maybe even more like software. Is that you need people credible in that domain, and you're looking credibility for funders or customers or partners. I'm sorry. Again, you just need to create that cloud of credibility. That would be
Look shiny.
right, and that's different from creating marketing BS. I mean, and it's a fine line between that and the reality distortion field. But because sometimes you have great technologists who kind of like roll their eyes at this other company who happened to raise a ton of money because they were able to credibly communicate what their differentiation was while you were still talking about science. And they were talking about, what the science meant for customers. Particularly in digital health, that's an incredibly, and when you're selling to consumers, an incredibly important thing is that how do you, in fact, what I've learned after 30 years, that it's really easy to make a complicated thing sound more complicated. It's a real art to make it sound like your mother could understand it. And that's the job for almost every one of you in here, is that, gee, we're used to talking to our peers at conferences and papers and, high bandwidth communication on like all the details. That, in fact, usually is a problem when you're trying to talk to investors, let alone a consumer audience. Question?
So for health tech or maybe even digital health or whatnot, have you seen good collaboration where someone from the technology side of the industry has successfully co-founded with a doctor or
Yes,
a researcher?
all the time.
And what's your opinion of that? Do you feel that it's a balanced team, or is it just
It's like balanced team meaning what? Are you the doctor?
No.
Or are you the techie?
My partner is the doctor. So
And are you the techie?
I am.
All right.
So,
Are you asking a very specific question? Are you asking me to run the diagnostic now or later?
There's a level of, as a former management consultant,
Yeah.
there's a level of hubris among many in the industry.
On the tech side or the other side?
No, on the management consulting,
Yes.
for example, that where folks feel, you know what, this is just a problem that needs to be solved.
Right. Those are the wrong people to have in a startup.
Um,
No, seriously.
And some people will focus in as, okay, this is a science problem and it needs to be solved, and I don't necessarily agree with that either.
So what's the question?
I guess the question is, have you seen good teams
Sure.
across different backgrounds?
So I did 8 startups, 3 of them with the same team. And 3 of those 3 ended up as 3 out of the 4 IPOs. For those of you who haven't done a startup, you should understand that the team formation is probably one of the most critical things, probably next to your science, that you're going to do. About, depending on the industry, somewhere between a quarter and half of startups melt down before they even get funded because of team issues. It's probably the highest stress, full-time relationship you're going to spend with anybody, including a spouse or significant other, if you're doing it right. You're going to be living with this team, and you need to know everybody kind of carries their weight in the way you expect, and it's always a surprise. You might get along great, or you might have met them or whatever, and expectations are kind of just mismatched, etc. I dramatically or deeply recommend programs where you could actually date founders for a while. The iCore is a good example, or even startup weekend stuff where you get to understand what that tension and crisis looks like when you're trying to do an impedance match with people from other cultures or other industries, and that combination of techies and scientists in medicine is also an impedance mismatch. What you really need for a startup early on is maybe not even a good board of directors before you raise money, but a good advisory board of people who've done this before, who understand the human side of this stuff, because there's almost always some interpersonal stuff that needs to be kind of deconflicted. I see this a lot, and you've given me some signs about the biggest one is kind of understanding, again, from both sides. It's not a science problem, and it's not a management execution problem. Both sides are incorrect there. It's a search for a business model problem. That's very different. That's like a new mindset. Wait a minute, we're both kind of searching. You think your science is, we just got to go implement it, and I'm thinking it's just a management problem. Here's the plan. Neither side is right. It doesn't work like that. We're both kind of out in the woods trying to figure out all the pieces of that business model. The answer is these collaborations, whether it was two scientists or different whatever, the whole team formation part is if not a dirty secret, a completely underinvested area of discussion about startups, whether they're in life sciences or not. And maybe a little worse in the life sciences, because the founders are so damn smart. They think it's something that you could pre-compute. You can't pre-compute. It's startups are in computer science, we call it an NP-complete problem. There's no way you could pre-compute all the potential outcomes, even though it seems pretty simple. I take my science, bag of money appears here. It doesn't work that way. I'm sorry, that's as best as I can answer the question.
Let's take two more questions.
Who has the
and then
best
we have a
questions?
reception
Best questions. All right. We'll take one here. You together get one question. So why don't you collaborate, and then I'll take this one. Yeah, take this one first.
Okay. How do you further diversify the types of funding within the NSF and the NIH? So I think the lean startup as a methodology is fantastic, and you're going to turn people into better entrepreneurs.
Good. Now I'll answer your question. Yeah.
But the problem is if you have a bunch of really efficient entrepreneurs, they might not run the entire gamut. Let's say within healthcare, right? So within healthcare, cardiothoracic intervention, for example, is incredibly sophisticated compared to mobility. Why does 1 in 3 over 65 fall?
Right.
And how do we start to answer that and further diversify the funding?
Yep. Again, above my pay grade, but what we're seeing now is this NIH program, which we're just going to start rolling out this year and next. Hopefully we'll kind of get engaged and start changing the culture in the NIH. If you're really just thinking, how many of you have gotten or know about the SBIR grants, right? Well, the SBIR grants kind of have they kind of have a desired outcome. Well, gee, how do we pivot inside of a SBIR grant, right? It says we can't. Well, we're now working, don't tell anybody, I'm the guy drafting the rewrite of what the SBIR grants will look like. Like I went, wait a minute, what if their outcome is kind of different? So the answer is on different levels, and it's not going to happen overnight, and maybe not in time for you, but we are going to start changing the culture of how we start thinking about doing this stuff. And I don't know if I'm answering your specific question, but it's going to take some time.
And for the record, I have a couple ideas for the rewrite.
Right, no, seriously, S. Blank at Stanford. Happy, and really, it was like I said, okay, we got the program, but wait, and they went, oh, who's going to rewrite that? And I went, okay, and they said, okay, don't tell anybody.
So for a software tech company, how can you scale up the customer interest levels, such as email signups to tens of thousands?
What kind of company? Software?
Software, yeah.
What kind of software?
Travel application, mobile tech. And so how can you prove the
You're on the wrong meetup.
So how can you prove the market with lots of signups?
Great, so you need to Google a phrase called growth hacking. No, there's in the customer development process, there's a third step called customer creation, which is scale. It now actually has a name called growth hacking. There's a whole set of literature now on this. Also, I have a website for those of you who want to read some interesting stuff, steveblank.com. The categories on the left include the NIH. You might want to look at that and some of the NSF stuff. But there's a tab on top called Startup Tools. If you click on that and then search for growth hacking, you'll find a whole series of articles and tools right on this question. Good. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Let's give not only Steve a hand, but another hand for the team of NYC Bio Volunteers that helped put this together, the NYU Biotech Club, our sponsor Triumvirate, and everybody, thank you for donating. That's why this is possible.